This is James Taylor, and you're listening to The Creative Life. The Creative Life podcast is a show created for you, the creative. If you're looking for inspiration, motivation, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's a musician, writer, artist, designer, performer, educator, or creative entrepreneur. They share their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, their insights, and much, much more. In this episode, I speak with Blake Branders, and we talk about growth mindset, overcoming rejection, and speaking in schools. Enjoy this episode. Hey, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Blake Branders. Blake is a TEDx speaker, co-founder of the personal development company Motivational Millennial, and co-host of the Motivational Millennial Podcast. He also runs a hip-hop motivational speaking business to help students remix their reality through assemblies and workshops. Blake was a recipient of the Marshall Scholarship, one of the most competitive postgraduate awards in the world, which he used to complete his master's and PhD on hip-hop and global youth cultures. And it's my great pleasure to have him on the show today. So welcome, Blake.
Thank you so much, James. Pleasure to be here with you.
So share with our listeners what's going on in your world just now.
It is action-packed at the moment. I just booked a 95 assembly motivational speaking tour in K through 12 schools across the U.S. So that's very exciting for the fall. So I'll be talking about growth mindset with the students and beatboxing and freestyle rapping. And as a skinny, nerdy, slightly awkward white kid from North Carolina, the students usually don't expect me to be the one who's freestyle rapping up there. So that's a lot of fun. And I'm also, as you mentioned, working with Motivational Millennial. And what we're doing right now is working with 20 and 30-year-olds who are looking to pursue their dream. They have something inside them they really want to accomplish, but they haven't gotten started. They keep coming up against roadblocks, either internal or external, and we really try to help them break through those barriers so they can actually become a coach or a speaker or a writer or whatever that dream is that they have inside them.
So when we first think about North Carolina, it is not the first place you imagine to be kind of getting into hip-hop culture and beatbox. So, where did it all begin for you there?
And even more unlikely that it would come out of Hickory, North Carolina. Emphasis on the hick, we like to say. So growing up in Hickory, I always loved poetry. I was an avid reader growing up. And I got into hip hop early on in high school with some DJing and some breakdancing, but I never thought that I could actually be a practitioner of hip hop. And what happened was I was in the cafeteria at my high school during lunchtime, and there was a commotion over by the lunch tables. And it turns out a group of people had formed a cipher, and that's basically a rap circle where one person's usually beatboxing, something like, and then the other people take turns freestyle rapping, so improvisational rapping on the spot. And I saw this and said, this is amazing. I definitely want to be a part of it. And so I went home and started practicing. And as you might imagine, I was terrible for a long time. I didn't necessarily know how to freestyle rap, and my flow was really awkward. But thankfully, the group of students at school who were really into hip hop didn't immediately reject me, but instead they said, this needs a little work, but keep doing your thing, man. And that encouragement was so critical for me. And I know you talk with a lot of people who are creatives and who want to express that creative side of themselves. And I think that encouragement is so important to continue the creative process or even get it started in the first place.
Was there a specific teacher, an English teacher or music teacher that kind of gave you a little bit of encouragement, or was it really more that the community of your kind of fellow students who were saying, keep going?
Absolutely. And that was actually how I even got into the hip hop motivational speaking part in the first place. I had a couple teachers who I asked if I could write essays about hip hop or write them in the form of a rap. And they kind of gave me a funny look and they were like, you rap? And I said, I do. And I'd love to combine the hip hop with what we're studying in class. And the usual response was, well, I mean, if you cite your sources and make it good, I guess that's fine. And so I actually did my senior thesis in high school as a U.S. history study guide for middle school students that was all in rap. And this predated Hamilton, the hip-hop theatrical show, by about 15 years. But it was really a great moment of using what I was passionate about to help other people. And that was how I continued in that journey on through college, using hip-hop to help other people. And I had no idea what I was going to be in my life. And I had no idea that something like what I'm doing now, or even getting a PhD in hip-hop, was even possible, let alone having someone else pay for it. So I think when I talk with students, one of the big messages that tends to resonate is if you have something you're passionate about, keep using it to help other people, even if you don't know where that might eventually lead you.
And so when you kind of started getting into the whole world of hip hop, was it primarily the music itself, or was it the culture? Because obviously with hip hop, there's a whole hip hop culture as well, art and everything else that's kind of going on there as well. Or was it very much just the music and the rhymes?
I love everything about hip hop culture. I love the entrepreneurship. I love this innovation around taking previously existing elements, whether that's musical samples and combining them together, whether that's dance styles and combining them together. And I loved the improvisational nature of it as well. So the fact that with just your voice, someone beatboxing and someone else rapping, you could create an entire musical experience anywhere at any time. And so that for me was some of the elements that really excited me. And then the wordplay was something that intellectually I found so engaging, because I liked poetry, but I found most of it to be pretty inaccessible. And, you really had to study and analyze it for it to make sense. And I just love that hip hop was direct, but also clever. And it was confrontational, but also had a message. And those elements really excited me about hip hop.
So we think about, I know that this year is actually the 100th anniversary of Ella Fitzgerald. And kind of going back in 1940s, she really kind of pioneered scatting as a style, as a vocal style. People kind of, and back then, I guess, jazz, and the jazz that she was singing was like the popular music of its day. It was the hip hop of its day. So what do you think let's say in 150 years time, what do you think people will be thinking about the period, especially like the 90s to 2000s, when hip hop, as it was an American art form, kind of came, but then obviously now it's global. What do you think they're going to look about this period in history?
I think part of the interesting element of hip hop is its socio-political engagement in a way that most other musical forms tend to be critical but removed. And hip hop has been so directly involved in global movements, whether that's the Arab Spring in North Africa and the Middle East, whether that's the riots in France, as second-generation immigrant youth have been protesting against police brutality and income inequality and lack of educational and professional opportunities. So I think when we look back at hip-hop in a historical perspective, it will be about how timely it was as an art form, but also how engaged it was in both grassroots movements and political protests, and also as a form of personal and political expression.
And as a hip hop artist, someone that beatbox and also kind of speaks about it, where do your ideas kind of come from? How do you kind of fill up that well of ideas, so when you're there and you're beatboxing, you're doing your thing, that you just it just feels like it's a flow?
It is a flow. Often when I'm creating albums, so I've written 7 albums now. I just this past weekend finished mixing my newest album, Remix Your Reality, which is 14 tracks of motivational hip hop, primarily designed for middle school, high school, and college students, but definitely it's accessible to everyone else. And so for this album specifically, I had this idea that I want to make hip-hop music that the beats are really catchy and the flow is really on point and the lyrics are really clever, but it has this core message about you are an empowered individual and you can make decisions that have a real impact on your life and the world around you. Because I think so many times young people especially feel like they're victims of their background or their history or their circumstances. And certainly we all have many struggles. Some are internal, some are external. But the real power that we all have is to choose a response to those circumstances that says, I might not be able to control all this, but I can use it to make an impact in the world. And so through the album, I wrote each of the songs about a different topic. So one of them is about dealing with failure, for example, a song called Flames. And it's about really embracing that if we're trying to do anything great in the world, we often have to be bad at it before we are good at it. And that's the growth mindset as well. This idea that our brain, the neuroscience shows us now that our brain, the neurons get stronger and bigger the more we do something. And we often call that mastery, when our brains have adopted this pattern that we can access so quickly, or that we recognize patterns in any given field very quickly. So when I'm coming up with ideas, usually I'll have a concept for an album and then think, what are the main points I want to make as a concept for a song? And then within the song, that's where I really let that flow come in. And I don't try to overly prescribe, I don't have like an outline of I want to make this point and then these 3 subpoints. Usually I have 3 main points I want to make in the song, and I let the metaphors and the imagery and everything flow and see how that song arrives naturally.
Now, millennials, of which you are one, and Gen Zs, I suppose, the people, a lot of the folks in school that you're going and speaking to, they get a pretty bad rap from other generations. There's it feels like there's quite a bit of generational strife just now. A lot of those,
yes.
Certainly here in the UK, where I'm speaking from today, but I know having lived in the US, there's same feeling where millennials and new generation kind of coming through. We feel like with the older generation has got a lot of those things that we weren't privileged to have. Was the chance to buy their homes and the chance for different types of education. It wasn't going to completely bankrupt you as well. So one of the things that you speak about, and you did a TEDx talk, was on this idea of the untapped power of the millennials. So tell us, for people that maybe got a misconception of what the millennial is about. We hear about millennials, we hear them, well, they're just kind of, they feel everything should be given to them and rewarded. What is our real misunderstanding that we have about millennials?
Absolutely, and thank you. The TEDx was an incredible experience, a bit harrowing, as I know you as a speaker have done some major stages as well. And specifically regarding millennials, I think the biggest misconception is this idea that because they are different, therefore they are bad. And people point to things like the entitlement and the laziness. And certainly there are elements of those behaviors that exist. But to simply write off an entire generation as entitled or lazy really misses the incredible potential that we're seeing coming out of the millennial generation. And when I talk about that potential, I'm talking about millennials reimagining how we engage with healthcare, how we engage with politics, how we engage with education. And what's so exciting is because of technology, which again, millennials often get a bad rap for being so deeply enmeshed with the technology. But because of that technology, we have the ability to connect people more broadly and more deeply than ever before who normally wouldn't be connected. And by leveraging those communities of influence, you see incredible startups come out, for example, around healthcare. You see incredible social movements rising up to combat income inequality, to think about the future of work as automation increasingly changes the kind of jobs that are going to be available, and reimagining what kind of education do we need when creative problem solving is the main tool in the workforce now, as opposed to compliance, which was the industrial model. And that's one of the things, James, I love about what you do on the Creative Life podcast, because I think you're really getting a lens into so many of these different models and modes of innovating and using creativity, both in expressive ways, but also to have a really significant impact on society and culture.
Now, you're about to go on a 95 date tour across speaking in schools. And myself as a professional speaker, I've spoken to lots of audiences, but one of the audiences that probably scares me the most is when I have to go and speak in schools, because this is a really, they're on it. You have to really be on it for that when speaking in schools. Well, so for any maybe of our listeners out there who are thinking about going and speaking in schools, maybe they have a message, you want to speak in schools. What are some of the things that they have to recognize about speaking to that particular audience? And what are some of the things that you maybe change that you would do when speaking in schools that maybe you don't when you're speaking in other types of maybe in organizations or something like TEDx?
Absolutely. Great question. So the first element is one of the core principles of any good speaking development, which is whatever you want to say with your message, film yourself saying it and watch that video. It'll be the most painful 20, 45 minutes of your life, as you know, but it will teach you so much about the unconscious vocal tics, the hand gestures, the pacing or lack of movement entirely. And so that's the first element, is gain that sense of self-awareness. Specifically when going into schools, what I did wrong, I'll say at the beginning, was I came into it with this idea that they're going to be confrontational. I have to prove myself to them. And so watching my very first videos, as painful as that is, it comes across a little defensive. And I probably could tell more than the students could. But what I do now is I go into every single speaking engagement in schools with the attitude that I am here to give these students the most exciting 45 minutes of their life. And we are going to have fun and we're going to engage, and possibly some of these ideas might help them transform their lives. And so when I go at it like that, you know what? If one kid is having a bad day and doesn't want to pay attention, that's fine. It doesn't affect me personally. Like, it's not about me. And so school audiences, especially middle school, I think is the trickiest, because middle schoolers really want to like the message, but they also can't act uncool. And so that usually means they're sort of sitting there. You can tell like they want to laugh, but they have to kind of mean mug you for the first 15 minutes. And so what I would just say there is know that what you're saying makes a difference. And when you're coming and bringing your message and heart without expectation, students pick up on that authenticity. And that's how I'm able to go into schools that are, for example, 100% Black students or 100% Hispanic students, or any given demographic, or alternative schools where these kids are in gangs or one step away from being kicked out of the educational system and ending up in prison. And that's the way I can go and connect with students like that. It's not because I try to be like them or something, but it's because they see I'm showing up as authentically me, and I'm self-deprecating, and I'm there to have fun and to share something with them that's been really important to me and I think can be really transformative in their lives. And they see that and they say, wow, this person actually cares about my happiness and my success. And for some of those students, it's the first time they've ever really gotten that message in their entire lives.
And one of those stories that I know that you share in schools to that audience is a moment that happened for you when you were doing a TV show, America's Got Talent. So tell us about that story. And I'm also interested to know, when you tell that story, because it really does open you up, in terms of to that audience, you kind of bear your sort of, the feelings that you went through, the highs and the lows of that experience. What have been the responses from both the students and the teachers to you telling that story?
Sure thing. So I made it through the first few rounds of America's Got Talent. This was a couple of seasons back, and ended up on stage in Madison Square Garden in front of 3,000 people and the 4 celebrity judges. And while I won't relive the entire experience, you're welcome to watch the TEDx if you want to see the play-by-play. Basically, what happened was they brought up a guy on stage, and I freestyle rapped about him. And when I was almost done with my rap, Howard Stern X'd me. And in that moment, I knew I had a choice. I was like, okay, I could keep rapping, just pretend like it didn't happen. Or maybe I should stop rapping, because if Howard didn't like it, maybe the other judges didn't like it either. And then I thought, wait a second, what if I turn this problem into an opportunity and flip it? And so I'll just do this little part. So with with a few seconds left, I just said, time is running out, but I'm not stressing. I came to reach the people and to teach a lesson. And what doesn't matter if Howard gets to Xing, I'm still gonna keep rapping, no question. And so the crowd goes wild, and they end up, the judges are debating for 30 minutes. The crowd's chanting, send him through, send him through. They bring out the golden buzzer, which would save me and bring me through to the next round because the judges are tied 2-2. And at the last moment, Howie stands up and he raises his hand and the crowd's going crazy. And he says, I just can't do it. I'm sorry. And so I didn't make it through. And what I tell the students is I had a choice to believe the story that the judges who didn't like me were saying, which was that I should just quit on my passion and go do something else with my life. Or I could choose to believe the story that the judges who liked me in the crowd were saying, Channing, send him through, like keep going. There's something good here. And what I realized was in that moment, the choice was mine to make. And because I chose not to give up on my passion and to use what I love to keep helping people, I was able to create a life and a career that I love. And so the reaction that students often give is, for one thing, they're on the edge of their seats the entire time. Literally, when I do the, Howie almost doing the golden button, usually some kids just like, oh my God, it's just going crazy. But afterwards, the students and teachers come up and they say, you know what? Thank you for sharing a time when you weren't successful, but you still used that to make your life better. And I think so often, especially in an era of social media, we see all these stories all the time about success and victories and how people were amazing. And this was a time when I failed from an objective perspective, or I didn't get the outcome I wanted, if we don't want to say failure like that. But what I realized was the external circumstances don't determine what I do with my life. And I think for a lot of students who've been told that they are failures or that they'll never amount to anything or they're not smart, that message is really transformative, that they have another option and another choice other than being what everyone else says they are.
I love you sharing that story, and I think it's a great story, and I can see how it's for many, you've talked about that kind of middle school level where there's huge amounts of peer pressure as well as everything else that's going on as well. And, and there's you up on stage in front of 3,000 people, one person on stage, which is, the nerves that must obviously kind of come from that as well. And to get that rejection from those particular judges in that way, in such a public way, I mean, that can really crush people for the rest of their lives. But how you talk about this in terms of the mindset that you had from that experience and what you decided to do with it, how you decided to use that. I'm kind of fascinated to see what happens with many of those kids that you speak to, because I don't know if your experience, but my experience in school was that there was good times and bads, but I do definitely remember those times where someone would come in and speak to our assemblies, or it would be a particular teacher. And those were they were transformational events in your life. Those small moments of you telling that story to those. 95 schools you're going to be speaking to. How many children is that you're going to tell that story to?
Yeah, probably close to 100,000.
So I think it'll be fascinating, because I can imagine in maybe 20 years to come, you'll be speaking at some other event and someone will come up to you and they will relate the story about how that particular story, about this idea of grit and determination and just having that kind of mindset to keep going and following your passion, kind of got to them and helped them to do what they do. So I commend you for kind of sharing that story, and especially for the work that you're doing with schools as well.
Well, thank you. And it has been really heartening to see and hear from students. And that's one of the great things about social media, is it does let students drop me a note afterwards. And, I do talk about depression in my high school speech. And I had a student who got in touch with me and said, hey, thanks so much for coming to our school. I've actually been really struggling with depression too. And because you told your story about asking for help, I actually reached out to the school counselor and some of my friends, and I'm doing a lot better. And I wanted you to know that. Or a student who got in touch with me and said, I've always wanted to pursue music, but everyone around me said that I just didn't have any talent. So I've actually enrolled in a course, and now I'm interning at a recording studio, and I'm actually following my dream. And so stories like that really do keep me going and motivated, because I see, you know what? If I go in on that day, like you said, and in those 45 minutes or in that hour and a half, if I'm, doing a couple at the same school, if I can even have that kind of transformational impact on one student's life, like, it's so worth it. That's one day of my life for an entire lifetime of theirs. And, I know we don't like to talk about money a lot often as creatives in the creative field, but when thinking about making a pitch to people who are buying your services, that's one of the things I really encourage, especially millennials, to think about the framing. Like, what is the impact that you're going to have? And if there's some way to quantify that. So if I said, at $1.50 per student, what is that worth if one of those students' lives is changed forever? And for the next 8 years of their school career, they are successful in ways they wouldn't have been otherwise. So I think sometimes we get really nervous talking about the potential impact we can have as creatives, because we don't want to overpromise, or we don't want to seem salesy. But that's one of the things that actually inspires me to keep asking for what I feel is a fair and appropriate rate, because I'm like, this is such a bargain. You know what I mean? Like, it's such a good deal in terms of having an impact on people's lives. And I know, James, through the coaching and speaking work that you do, it's the exact same thing. It's when people hear your message and when you connect with them deeply and transform their lives, like, that is priceless.
So you're giving those kids, many of those kids, those kind of aha moments where they're going, oh, okay, actually, this is the direction I want to go. I want to try this. I'm going to give this a shot. So for yourself, what was that maybe kind of key light bulb or aha moment in your own growth in your own life?
I think one of the most unlikely transformational moments for me was an argument I had in a restaurant in Paris. And what happened was, I had been doing research for a week on how French immigrant youth were using hip hop to express themselves and protest in ways we talked about earlier. And I'd been working with one of my friends for that entire week, and she and I had just been butting heads the whole week, and it just been really tense and really frustrating. And finally, over this dinner, we just had it out. And I was like, what has been going on? This week has been ridiculous. And she just said to me, yeah, well, I think so too, and I think it's your fault. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, all you do is ever ask me questions. I feel like I'm being interrogated. And I said, well, that's funny, because I feel like you never ask me questions, and all you do is talk about yourself. And what I realized in that moment was, my idea of a communication style was to ask people questions, and they would ask me questions back. And that was how we showed we were interested and we cared about each other. Her communication style was to tell a story about her own life, and then expect the other person to tell a story too. And that way, through self-divulging, you would get to know each other and trust each other and like each other more. And it was such a transformative moment for me, because I had been so sure that I was the nice person and I was the kind person. I was the giving person in every situation, because I was the one who would always ask all the questions. And what it made me realize was, I was actually being selfish by not sharing more of myself with my friends and with the world. And that was transformative for me, because then I realized my story can actually help people. And so when we're thinking about all the creatives out there who are working on their art but afraid to share some of the dark times or some of the challenging parts or some of the messy parts, I say that's the thing we want and need to hear the most, because that is what makes you human and that's what makes you relate to us. So that very awkward dinner conversation in Paris really transformed my life. And
I mean, how would that recognition, that realization of these different kind of communication styles, how people want to be communicated with, and to your role now in terms of speaking in schools, I'm guessing, trying to convince or bring on board a school, a teacher, a headmistress, headmaster, to hire you, to pay money from what is often a very tight budget within education and schooling, how does that conversation begin? And then how do you communicate in such a way that you really can impress on that person the value that you speaking to that audience is going to give to both the school and also to the students?
I love this question because I think it applies to anyone who is trying to share their art or their message in any medium. So what I look for first is to help the person get truly aligned with their goals and their visions and their values. Because I think most of us, when we start having a conversation, especially one that does involve money, we get afraid and we get nervous and our defenses go up because, we've been dealt with by pushy salespeople over the years, or we've had bad experiences, or we feel like we've spent money that wasn't a good fit for us. So one of the first things I really try to do is make sure that this person I'm talking with is aligned with what they want for the future. What are their outcomes? What are their goals? What are their dreams for whatever they're doing? So in the case of a principal, a headmaster, I say, what kind of outcomes do you want for your students? And they'll usually say things like, I want my students not to give up when things get hard. I want my students to stop bullying each other. I want my students to be more successful on our state tests. There's some very tangible outcomes, but some of them are behavioral too. And so I say, okay, great. And I'll share some about the growth mindset or some about empathy, which is my anti-bullying program, and say, does this sound like it helps address those needs that you mentioned? And then they'll usually say yes, or they'll have some more questions. And then from there, I say, okay, well, so you think this program would be a good match for the needs to support your students? And they say yes. And so I say, okay, and then here's the price. And at that point, what we've established is this is an alignment with something they actually want and need. Because sometimes they'll say, I don't need this, or this isn't a good fit. And I'm not there to try to convince them that they need it. Like if they're in alignment that this is not what they need for their students, then I say, that's great to hear. I'm so glad you shared that with me. And if they have something else they need, I can refer them to other people. But at the end of the day, I'm there to try to make sure they get the most of what they want. And so for me, it doesn't feel like selling at all, because it's not. Like, it's literally, for me, it's about helping people get alignment and make commitments that they're excited about.
And how aware are those teachers, with the principals, heads of department, there's that classic thing that sometimes happens when anyone is looking to buy something. There's the thing that you think you want, and actually the thing that you need. Often two completely separate things. So sometimes where are you brought in to do one type of work, but actually you kind of work in something else instead, because you actually recognize either when you're actually in the room with those students, or just in conversations with the principal, actually this is not good. You're saying this, but actually I think you really need this instead. What do you think about this?
Yes, and this is a great lesson in marketing, because I started out marketing myself as a hip-hop motivational speaker. And I got some positive responses from that, but nowhere near the number of responses when I started sending out a message that said, I'm doing growth mindset and grit assemblies. And here's the distinction. People see hip-hop motivational speaker and they have a couple immediate assumptions. One is it's going to be inappropriate for school because it's hip-hop and I don't like hip-hop. Or they go to my website and they're like, oh, it's hip-hop, but whoa, that's a interesting-looking white guy. I'm not sure that's going to resonate with our students. So I was marketing me initially. And then when I shifted to growth mindset and grit, growth mindset, by the way, is, sorry, I haven't to explain that. It's Carol Dweck, who is a psychologist. It's her idea that, based on the neuroscience, that our brains grow and they strengthen the more we do something, as we were talking about earlier with the patterns. And so it's contrasted with a fixed mindset, which is you are born with a certain talent and you can never truly get much better than what you're born with. And so this is really important for students who are learning, because it's really easy if they fail at something a few times to say, I'll never be good at math, or I'll never be good at English or history. And so that's why it's such a powerful intervention. And so you're absolutely right. When I'm going into schools, the hip hop is the thing that helps students connect. And I was missing that when I was initially talking about what I was doing, because I was leading with that. But what the outcomes that the principals and the headmasters and the teachers want is really for students to be resilient and for students to be open to trying new strategies of learning and not shut down. Or in the case of bullying, they want students to be empathetic. And so once I understood that I needed to lead with what they needed the most, the entire marketing equation transformed. And I was, to answer your question specifically, when I would go into schools, then I would still share a lot of the same things I've been sharing, which was this inner transformation, this idea that you do have decisions and choices that can truly change your life. And we're always telling ourselves this internal story. But now the wrapper around it, no pun intended, was something that was much more palatable to the organization.
That's great. I mean, that's a great distinction to make. And I think that's really useful, regardless of who your customer is out there, whether you're an artist or you're an entrepreneur, just that little realization sometimes of how you kind of changed it like that, tweaked it, and it really kind of comes around because of listening, really active listening to your potential customer. So that's wonderful. I'm interested. Do you have an online resource or a tool or a mobile app like an Evernote that you absolutely love?
Yes, I'm a huge fan of Acuity, Acuity, for scheduling. We use this for scheduling coaching sessions, for podcast interviews, and it is so intuitive. It integrates with all your calendars, and I have been using it for 7 months now, and it has saved me at least 50 hours of work that I used to have to manually do, plugging everything in. So huge fan of Acuity.
Wonderful. And if you could only recommend one book and one record, one album to our listeners, what would they be?
So the book would be The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, because it is truly revolutionary when you realize that you've got a voice that's just talking in your head ad infinitum, and you can choose to listen to that voice or zoom out and understand that that is not truly you, that there's a you behind the voice, and that's just the presence. It's the thing you feel when you're just sitting and you don't have anything running through your mind. You're just looking at something beautiful. And that book was so transformational for me because I realized how often I was buying into the story that my mind was telling me about how I'm not enough in all these different ways, right? I'm not experienced enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not attractive enough. I don't have enough money. All this, I'm not enough. And as soon as I separated that as a story from who I actually am, I was so empowered to change so many things in my life, to exercise with CrossFit, to book this motivational tour. And I haven't shared this before, but part of the reason that I was so driven to book this motivational speaking tour is I had applied to a speaker agency because I thought, man, I've been doing this for 15 years. Now is the time for me to not be booking all my own gigs. And the speaker agency wrote back and very politely said, essentially, you're not good enough. And so I looked at that and I said, are you kidding me? I said, fine, watch this. I'm going to go book an entire speaking tour all by myself. And so I did. I literally booked the entire speaking tour, the 95 assemblies, by myself. And that's not good entrepreneurial skills by any stretch of the imagination.
That's great. I love that you can use that the anger, the feeling you get from that rejection, and turn it into a very positive thing. And I know with speaker bureaus, there's wonderful speaker bureaus out there, but it's that classic thing that when you feel that when you need them, they don't want to take you on. But when you're at the stage in your career you don't need them, is exactly the time that they want to take you on as a client. It's a real catch.
It is so true. It is so true. And so it was just that affirmation that I am enough, and also, as Seth Godin says, that I can choose myself. So that was a bit of a tangent from the book, but the album I would recommend is by a Canadian rapper named Shad, S-H-A-D, and the album is called Lost Backwards, so T-S-O-L, and it's hip-hop for people who don't like hip-hop, I'll say that, meaning that it's all clean, there's no swearing, it's brilliant with the wordplay, multi-syllable rhymes, incredible concepts for the song, and that was really what I was trying to do with my album Scholar, which I wrote as part of my PhD dissertation, which was to make an album that was accessible, that was intelligent, that was funny, and that sounded really good, so that people who normally said, oh, I can't understand hip-hop, or I feel it's all just violent and misogynistic and materialistic, I was like, okay, I want something that's the opposite of that. And Shad really embodies that. So
fantastic. We'll put these all in the show notes. People just go to jamestaylor.me, type in Blake Brandis. You're going to get all the links for this as well. Final question for you. Let's imagine, Blake, you woke up tomorrow morning and you had to start from scratch. So you have all the tools of your trade, all the knowledge that you've acquired over the years, but no one knows you. You know no one. You have to start again. How would you restart? What would you do?
So first thing, do 5 free speaking engagements at local schools. Second thing, contact school districts and ask them, what are your district priorities for the coming school year? So whether that's strategic priorities or educational priorities, and align whatever program I'm doing to those priorities. And then basically they're telling you what they're going to buy. And so I think this applies for anyone. And it goes back to what you said about active listening, which is that often people will tell you what you want if you're willing to ask them. And then when you can share with them your offering and they say, oh, yeah, this is exactly what I told you I wanted, and now it's a great fit, then that makes a huge impact.
And finally, Blake, what's the best way for people to connect with you, learn more about your speaking and all the other things that you have on the go just now?
Absolutely. So everyone can go to motivationalmillennial.com. That's millennial, MILLENNIAL. And we also have a free gift on there. It's an e-guide called Transforming Your Millennial Mind. And so anyone who's feeling stuck in their creative process, you're welcome to go on there. And as a gift for your podcast audience, I would be happy to share that with them for free. It's at motivationalmillennial.com/free gift.
Well, Blake, thank you so much for coming and sharing your incredible story. And I look forward to hearing you speak sometime. And I wish you all the best with your upcoming speaking tour.
Thank you, James.
Hey, James Taylor here again. And if you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.